In this last shooting example, we will be talking about capturing motion. When you shoot a moving object, you have several things to consider. The first is how much motion you want to capture. Do you want to freeze all of the motion? Are you going for a shot with some definite motion blur? Are you shooting in a difficult lighting situation and are willing to sacrifice a bit of motion blur to get the shot? These are all things that you need to consider. When you are shooting something with motion, unlike the other examples, shutter speed will be the primary focus. Aperture and ISO will need to work to expose the photo. In areas where light is abundant, you'll have a lot of options. But when light is scarce, sacrifices will need to be made. Let's take a look at a few examples of shooting some motion. First outside and then inside. All right, we're going to take a look at capturing some motion here outside, and we're going to do it a couple different ways. We're out in a parking lot here, and I'm going to have my kids ride around in the circle here, and we're going to experiment with some different values on the camera here and see what we can get, both getting some motion blur and completely freezing the action as they come by where I'm positioned here. This is my daughter Lily here, and we might get a couple of shots of her, although she's pretty slow moving here. So right now I have my camera set to shutter priority, and this way it's going to set the aperture value for me, because what I'm going to focus on is just getting the shutter speed. I have the ISO set at 100 because we're out here in full direct sun. There's not a single cloud in the sky, so we have plenty of light to work with. In fact, at shutter speed of 100, we're getting f13 to f14 metering here. So that's going to be completely fine. So as the kids come around the corner here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the center focus point, and I'm going to track with them, and then I'm just going to push the shutter down and rip a whole bunch of frames off. I have this set to high speed drive mode, so it'll let me do a whole bunch of frames. So my daughter's coming around right now. I'm going to get into a nice low position here. Oh, she's going to do a Superman. All right, here comes my son. Cool. I have here a viewfinder, an LCD viewfinder, because it's really difficult to see what's going on the LCD here in full direct sunlight. Right now I'm at shutter speed of 100, and it looks pretty cool. I'm getting some motion blurring of the background, but it's not drastic. The further we are zoomed in, the faster they're going to come by the frame. Cool. All right, here comes my son Lincoln. I'm going to get a little closer. In this shot, the panning speed was a little bit off, which resulted in some motion blur of my son Lincoln. Shooting in a burst will increase your keeper rate, as you can track your subject while you're firing off frames. By panning the camera and tracking with them, what we're doing is we're getting the background blurry and they're more or less frozen. If we do a good job panning, we can get most of their body to be pretty sharp. So now that we have that, I'm going to roll up to 2/50th of a second, have them come by again, and then now we're looking at f6.3, which is a little bit more wide open. We're getting a little bit of blurring at this shutter speed here. This is 1/250th of a second. And if I was at something like 80 millimeters or 100 millimeters, we'd get even more blurring. All right, here comes my son. Come right by the camera, okay? What I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna get nice and close, and I'm gonna pull back to a wider focal length. All right, come right here, bud, right next to me, all right? And we'll get a different perspective here. Because we're at a wider focal length, at the same shutter speed, 1/250th of a second, we're not getting as much background blurring. So the sense of them moving is been reduced. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go back to 50 millimeters. I'm at 1/500th of a second. Here come the kids again. Come as fast as you can, paddle, paddle. That's great. On these focal lengths, 1/500th is gonna pretty much freeze the motion, even though they're moving pretty quick here. Probably the optimum for a little bit of blurring is between maybe 1/25 and 1/250th, depending on your focal length. If we were shooting at 200 millimeters and we were 20 feet back, we'd really be panning really fast, and that would look a whole lot different. But at these focal lengths, about 125, we'll try one more at 60, and I'll get really close. Come right by me, okay, right here. All right, real close. 1/60th of a second actually works really nicely if we're pulled way back like this. I'm gonna try 1/50th of a second and see how much panning we can get here. All right, bud, come nice and close to me. I want you to come right here, okay? Really close and really fast. All right, really close. Nice, we got some really good blurring there. Very cool. So with this lens, a 17 to 50 millimeter zoom lens, you can see we can get a bunch of different looks doing some panning motions. We can stop the motion completely using shutter speeds of 1/500th of a second. We can get some motion blurring if we're between 1/250th and below, but around 1/60th to 1/50th, it becomes almost too blurry to use depending on what you're shooting. We probably could get some sharp ones in there if we really tracked really nicely, but they'd only be sharp right down the center. Everything else would pretty much be blurry. So experiment with your shutter speeds. It's a lot of fun. You can get a lot of cool different looks, both stopping motion and getting some motion blur to show what's happening in your photos. So let's move to the indoors and talk about capturing motion when you're inside. Now you're looking at a collection of photos that I shot this season at my kids' wrestling tournaments all around New York State. And capturing motion inside can be especially difficult because you don't have a whole lot of light to work with. Now, all of these were shot inside of high school, middle school gymnasiums, all with just terrible lighting. Just like we talked about in the group shots portion of this course. All the light comes from above. Usually they have white painted ceilings, so it's very, very soft light, which doesn't give you a whole lot of contrast. And the light levels are also really, really low. So what I end up doing is usually sticking the camera in shutter priority or manual. I think most of these were shot in manual. I set the aperture at f4 and the shutter speed anywhere from 200 to 250. That's not really fast enough to stop the motion completely in most cases. A lot of these do have a slight amount of motion blur. You can see in almost all of them, there's just a little bit of motion blur, but that's okay because the ISOs for almost all of these photos are all above 1,000. Most of them are between 3,200 and 6,400. They are all really high. That means that they're grainy, but I was looking for f4 to get a little bit of depth of field. f2.8 on this lens is a little bit soft, but also it's a little bit shallower. So I was hoping to get just a little bit more depth of field at the cost of a higher ISO, which means more noise. And that's just something that you have to deal with. And there's nothing really special about these photos. Most of the time I took them in a burst and tried to get some of these in focus. So the one thing that you have to know when you're shooting inside is, unless you're shooting with a prime lens, you're probably going to be working at apertures around f2.8 or f4. Not all lenses are super sharp at f2.8, so you may be looking at f4, which is what I was doing in this particular case. We're looking at my daughter Ella here in the black here, just destroying boys in co-ed here. Really, none of these guys had a good day at that tournament there. A couple of these you can see here from that shadow there. I did use a speed light. I didn't want to use a speed light for a lot of these though, because I didn't want to distract the wrestlers here. The guys in black and the girls in black are from our wrestling club. And certainly you can get a nice punchy photo with a speed light, but you know, when you're kind of on matte level shooting these photos, it can be a little bit distracting to have a big bright strobe go off right in these kids' faces. So I only did it here and there. When I did, you could definitely tell it looks like a shot that's been lit with a strobe, but for the most part, I didn't. And I tried to get as close as I could. I was using a 28 to 75 f2.8 non-stabilized lens, but because I was shooting at shutter speeds of 200 and 250th of a second, it wasn't a huge deal. That's one of the things that you have to know if you're shooting in a gym, you're going to get noisy shots. That's just the way it is. Unless it's a facility that's set up for television broadcast or something, when they have the light levels that are what I would call appropriate, you're going to have noisy shots, but that's okay. And, everyone's shots will be noisy. And hopefully, if you use some of the things that we talked about and use some of the ideas we talked about in this course, your photos will look great.